The United Nations wants to discuss granting recognition to the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, and it wants to discuss this with international envoys in about 2 weeks' time. UN Deputy Secretary-General Amina Mohammed, speaking at an event on Monday, said a meeting between the UN Secretary-General and envoys on Afghanistan was being planned, and the subject of granting recognition to the Taliban was expected to come up.
We have some amazing envoys that work on Afghanistan, and we have Afghan women too. And what we are hoping is that we will gather them now in another 2 weeks in the region, and they will have that first meeting of envoys across the board, the region and internationally, with the Secretary-General for the first time. And out of that, we hope that we will find those baby steps to put us back on the pathway to recognition.
And apparently that meeting is set for the 1st of May in Doha. That's as per a tweet by former US envoy to Afghanistan, Zalmay Khalilzad. While recognition for the Taliban could be on the cards, the country they govern remains in the grip of a dire humanitarian crisis. Despite that, the Taliban is dedicating the largest share of Afghanistan's funds to the military, funds that are coming from boosted tax and customs revenues. Speaking to Reuters news agency, Chief of Army Staff Qari Fasihuddin Fitrat spoke of how the Taliban Army intends to use the money to expand and purchase high-tech weapons.
We made good progress in less than 2 years, and currently we have 150,000 Defence Force personnel. But this is not our final goal. We are progressing step by step to ensure that all our needs in terms of Defence Force personnel have been fulfilled.
اطمینان پیدا بکنیم که حالا تمام نیازمندی‌های کشور ما در راستای داشتن یک اردوی منظم و درست. برای علاوه از اینکه نیروهای
In addition to the people who were involved in jihad, who are Taliban members, we have a large number of former defense force in our organization. And we have new registered forces as well. And all of them are serving our country under one law and principle. We do not distinguish between them.
یا این کسی که از اردوی قبل است و از جمله مجاهدین و طالب است بدون از این کلازی در چوکات امارت اسلامی خدمت میکنند. این از ضرورت‌های یک کشور هست.
Anti-aircraft missiles are needed by countries. All countries are trying to have developed weapons to have both airspace and territorial integrity under their control.
هم حریم زمینی و هم حریم هوایی خود و در کنترل داشته باشد و حفاظت بکنه.
Our country, Afghanistan, is facing this problem. There is no doubt that Afghanistan is trying and doing its best to procure anti-aircraft missiles.
And joining me now for more context is Graeme Smith, Senior Consultant on Afghanistan with the International Crisis Group think tank and author of the book, The Dogs Are Eating Them, Now Our War in Afghanistan. Mr. Smith, why is Afghanistan, a country coping with record levels of hunger and poverty, investing the largest share of its budget in its military?
Well, you'd have to ask the Taliban, but if I were to guess, it's because Afghanistan is recovering from the deadliest war on planet Earth. It was a war that displaced hundreds of thousands of people annually and killed upwards of 40,000, 50,000 people a year. And so in that chaotic aftermath, the Taliban have been trying very hard to establish security. And by all accounts, they have succeeded. Humanitarians now say they can reach the furthest districts of Afghanistan in vehicles that aren't armored, without convoys of military men. And so it is very important in the chaotic aftermath of the war to establish security.
How much money are we talking about, and where is the Taliban government getting this money from?
Well, the Taliban has taken over the state apparatus and essentially not fired anybody. And they've used the same computer systems for tracking their finances that the previous government used. And so that's why, for example, the World Bank and other analysts get good readouts of how the revenues work. The Taliban are collecting something in the order of $2 billion a year in state revenues. They've wiped out something like $1.4 billion a year in corruption from the previous government. So even though they have cleaned house and very much reduced the levels of corruption that were endemic under the previous regime, there is still, a huge budget shortfall. And so that's why you see low spending by the Taliban on things like health and education, because they really are leaning on the international community to help with some of these service deliveries.
How does the Taliban explain to ordinary Afghans who are struggling to feed their kith and kin this amount of expenditure on the military?
Well, I think you'd have to keep in mind that the insurgency in Afghanistan was overwhelmingly local. NATO calculated that something like 80 or 90% of Afghans fought within 1 kilometer of their own homes. So, the Taliban are essentially explaining to their own supporters why they are paying salaries to their own men who are now part of the security forces. So that's an easy explanation to make. By all accounts, the total payroll has now ballooned to something in the order of 800,000 civil servants, because you're now including a lot of these ex-Taliban fighters within the security forces. But, they have also reduced salaries, as I say, cut corruption. So they are doing what they can to try to balance the books in this incredibly difficult time.
In the interview to Reuters, the army chief went on to say, and I quote, "We have a large number of former defense force in our organization." The news coming out of Afghanistan was that the Taliban were actively targeting former Afghan army members. Is that not the case?
So the news coming out of Afghanistan should be read with an understanding that a lot of the people producing the news were fighting against the Taliban in the previous war for 20 years. So, it's not exactly an unbiased picture that we get here in the West. But anyways, yes, it is correct that the Taliban have been hunting down some elements of the previous security forces, particularly in the intelligence and the notorious militias that were so widely known for their abuses during the previous regime. And so, yes, there have been a number of reprisal killings. Those are very well documented by the United Nations. But, they have been on a fairly small scale. This is, by some accounts, the most bloodless transfer of power that Afghanistan has seen in the last century, because the Taliban issued an amnesty and they told members of the security forces that, look, we're not going to hunt you down, we're not going to kill you. And in fact, they have been bringing on a number of these people for their technical expertise, because, keep in mind, the Taliban took over a very large state apparatus and they didn't know how to run it. And so not just in the security ministries, but all across the government, the Taliban have been forced to work with the people who used to be fighting them in order to try to make the state run.
Is that where most of these 300,000 serving members of the Afghan military, a number that President Joe Biden gave in 2021, went?
Well, so officially there was what was called a tashkil, or a roster, of about 350,000 members of the army, police, and intelligence services under the previous government. And there had always been concerns that a large number of those so-called personnel were just ghosts, that somebody was pocketing the money and, spiriting it out of the country. And, as we saw with the Taliban offensive in 2021, that did turn out to be true, as, these units just melted away, disappeared, or just never existed in the first place. So when the Taliban disbanded the former security forces, in some places there wasn't anything to disband. In other places, it did result in really wholesale unemployment, particularly in the provinces of Badakhshan and Nangarhar, which had supplied a lot of the manpower to the previous security forces. And then in other places, as you've seen now, the Taliban are bringing back former personnel and incorporating them into their new security forces, which they're in the process of rebuilding.
There have also been questions raised time and again about the amount of U.S. military equipment left behind by withdrawing forces. This includes helicopters and guns, for instance. Can you help us clarify this? Has any of that been useful to the Taliban?
Yes, it's been tremendously useful to the Taliban. A lot of the equipment that was left behind served to arm the Taliban security forces. In fact, that was a process that was already ongoing over the last 20 years because the enormously corrupt security forces were selling their weapons, selling their ammunition to the Taliban. And so the Taliban were very familiar with how to use the US supplied weaponry. I think we have not yet seen the sort of wholesale spread of weapons into the region as some had feared. There were serious concerns when the Taliban took over that there might be spillover, for example, of leftover weaponry into the Fergana Valley and destabilize Central Asia, that you might see some of this weaponry turning up in large numbers in Kashmir. And we haven't really seen that on the scale that had been feared because the Taliban had been trying to round up leftover weaponry and do safe cantonment and storage of these armaments. And so it remains to be seen, I think, whether the Taliban can meet that challenge of trying to clean up all of the leftover weaponry that is all over this territory. But that's, again, another reason why the Taliban are investing so heavily in security right now.
We'll leave it there for the time being, but thank you so much for that very interesting perspective and context, Graeme Smith.